All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for coming to Communicating During a Crisis with Confidence. I'm Steffi. I lead communications for Allraise. Before we get started, I just want to go over a couple quick housekeeping items. At this point, this is probably like listening to the flight instructions before your flight, or the safety instructions, but kind of miss those. Anyway, just to remind you all, some Zoom webinar features. You can use the chat function to introduce yourself to others on the call. You could also ask questions there if you like. There's also a Q&A box for that at the bottom of your Zoom panel. And our amazing speaker today is Nairi Hourdajian, CMO of Canaan. Nairi is a founding member of Allraise and was previously Uber's first head of global communications, where she built the team and function from scratch. She spent her early career in politics and advocacy, and I've seen her on pretty much every list of top PR leaders. I feel really lucky to know her and benefit from her advice, and I know you will too. So welcome, Nairi.
Thank you, Steffi. Very kind of you. So happy to be here and to be with you all today amidst this unprecedented time. And since I think we're mostly women on this call, I would like to let you know that I did blow dry my hair for you, and it was the first time in a long time. So you're welcome. For those of you. Okay, so let's just jump in. I'm going to talk first at a high level about some communications best practices in crisis, not specific to the current crisis that we're in, but with themes that carry over. Then I'll dive in a little bit more specifically to consideration sets within a COVID world, and then talk about a couple of key themes that came out of your questions, and then we'll open it up to your own Q&A. And Steffi, I will watch the clock, but please keep me honest as well, so we have time for chat Q&A and whatnot.
Absolutely.
So just to give a little more color on my background, as Steffi said, I am the CMO at an early stage venture fund called Canaan. We invest across sectors, meaning life sciences and technology, and we're early stage investors. My background early in my career was all in politics. That's where I cut my teeth in crisis initially, both working for candidate campaigns as well as clients from an advocacy and crisis management perspective. Everyone from News Corp during their hacking scandal to Epsilon during their data breach, Toyota during their brakes issues, and transitioned from my politics and advocacy work to technology. I joined Uber early on in the company's life and led comms for 3.5 years, and joined fairly early when we were under 300 employees. When I left, we were 12,000, and I grew the comms team from 1 to about 50, and the whole comms and policy org was about 200 when I left. So it was a wild, wild time. I dealt with more crises than I can remember, but I will try to share some stories today to help illustrate some of the key points. And I don't know if she ended up joining. Yes, she did, but my colleague from Uber, Kellen, who was on the policy team, is also on this call, and she can chime in if I have any revisionist history. Okay, so let's dive in. Crisis and issues are not the same. Issues are everyday, and crisis is like debilitating. So you will know when you are in crisis. And it's really important to remember that there's a difference between crisis and issues. How will you know when you're actually in a crisis? One, whatever you're facing will feel and actually be an existential threat to your business, to your organization. Two, the volume of shit will be very, very high, excuse my language. You will have press inquiries coming like crazy. Your social activity will be wild. You'll have investors calling, you'll have customers calling, all members of your community. There will be like, you will know based on that volume. And then you'll see multiple shoes dropping. You see this all the time when you look out into the domain. Organizations that have one issue find themselves in a crisis moment, and then day after day after day, new revelations, new issues come to light. And the fact that those shoes are dropping means, as our old boss, Kellens and mine at Uber used to say, and also Obama's 2008 campaign manager, David Plouffe, you're in the barrel and you've got to stay in the barrel for a little while. So that's the first thing. Next, what are your principles for effective crisis management? And this is from a communication standpoint. You know, I'm just going to dive right in so we can make this as practical as can be. But first, you have to try to prepare. And I say try because you will never know 100% what's coming around the corner. We'll get to that in a minute. 2, you have to be disciplined. Once you've decided on your course of action, the actual thing you're going to do to address the crisis, and then how you're going to communicate about it, stick to it. It's going to be very tempting to see what else is going on and look around at other people, be responsive to one investor, to one partner who's asking a particular question that they're particularly keen on. But once you've really thought about your right course of action and decided to follow through on it, stick with it. And then third, and this is, I hope this doesn't sound counter to my last point, you also have to know when to adapt. And we'll get into some detail around that. So first, on preparation. If anyone on this call had global coronavirus pandemic in your crisis scenario planning for 2020, kudos to you. The reason I say that is maybe some of you are in and around the healthcare space, but usually when one goes through a scenario planning exercise, you're going to think of scenarios that are particular to your business and your organization. There are some that cut across all. For example, you always want to plan for a key woman or key man issue. Something happens to like you, the founder, the CEO, like that should be something your team prepares for. That's true across a lot of companies. But you know, this kind of specific scenario that we're in right now, I wouldn't imagine would be in your scenario planning, and that's okay. The most important first step is to think about where are the highly controversial regulatory issues, public policy, PR issues, security issues, you know, whatever your core business is, you know, consumer problems that you may face. And you need to imagine what those scenarios would be, pick a few and plan around them. And get really granular in how you plan around them. And I'll get to that. Build your team. Who's going to be part of that? Who is going to be, you know, the point person on working with you? And I know we have both founders and CEOs on this call, and we have marketing folks. I know we have folks across a lot of different verticals, but who's kind of going to be the point person? Make sure you have the right people. Build your war room process. How are you going to make decisions? Will the CEO weigh in on every minute decision around whatever communications plan for a particular crisis? That's fine, but you need to set expectations early that decision making needs to happen quickly. Prepare your message toolbox. So you know, in these, you're planning for 3 scenarios, and you can build your messaging for each of them. It's important to do that in advance. You're not going to ship out messaging that you've built in advance with this crisis scenario planning as is. The benefit of doing it, though, is that then when your adrenaline's pumping and you're in the moment and you're under the gun and you have very little time, you have the benefit of starting with something other than a blank piece of paper. You've put thought into it. You've sat around a room and collaborated with people with the benefit of time so that in the moment you can just run. Who are your key audiences going to be? You have your messaging, but who do you need to deliver it to? Again, this is going to be so unique to every organization, but making sure that you know who those are. And then you need to identify and prepare your spokespeople and validators. And you can do that well in advance, because what you can do is, you know, media train your spokespeople. You know, coach them on public speaking if they're going to be the person addressing the team internally. Who are your validators? Who will be the people who will stand with you, who will amplify your message, and be outside validators for your mission and message. Make sure you have built those relationships and know that you're expecting that of them when the time comes. So that's on the prepare side. It sounds, this is the kind of thing that can slip very far down the priority list with good reason. You have product to ship, you have funding to close, you have engineers to hire so that you can actually do the things you say you're going to do. It's important to think about this though, if you can, as far in advance as you can. It really will help you. And the way to be thinking about it, and I try not to lean too hard on politics, but if you had a competitor who was trying to kneecap you, what would be the things that they would wish would happen to you? And those, you need to be your own best researcher. In politics, you call it opposition research. You do research on the other candidate. But you need to do that on yourself. It's called self-research. You need to be your own self-researcher and understand what your weaknesses are, and then how to think about A, shoring them up, but B, until they're shored up, how are you going to address them? Second, on be disciplined, you want to optimize for speed and accuracy. So in any of these crisis scenarios, and COVID is one example, but it's not specific to any one company. And so I'm not going to use that in this particular example, but I'll give you a related one, a related anecdote in a moment. You want to optimize for speed and accuracy. And in a COVID world, let's say you have to shut down your physical space. You're a physical space company and you need to shut one of your physical spaces down. You need to quickly get that message out to people in a way that is accurate, in the right tone and the right messages, et cetera. You want to optimize for speed, but you also don't want to ship it before you've made all of the decisions about what it means and how you're going to be able to still serve your customers, if you're going to be able to still serve your customers. And that's what I mean by optimizing for speed and accuracy. At some point, you might need to go out with something before you have all the information, and it's okay to say that. You don't have to pretend you have all the information. Pick a strategy and execute, and then wait, but it will be hard. So here's where I'd like to share an anecdote that's actually a little bit COVID related. If you had told me that when I was working at Uber, we were going to deal with an Ebola specific crisis, I would have told you were crazy. What does Ebola have to do with Uber? Nothing, right? But in fact, one of the patients in New York City who had tested positive for Ebola, who was a physician, did ride in an Uber at some point before knowing that he was positive for Ebola. And at the time, as you know, Ebola is different from COVID in that it's highly spreadable in a different way. It's, I think, through the air. So anyway, and much more scarier in a lot of ways, even though the numbers of how it affected people here in the United States were very low. And so we had to figure out what the public health guidance was. We had to reach out to the city, to the public health department, to the mayor's office. We had to understand what the expert guidance from them was. Should that driver come off of the platform? Should he be tested immediately? Do his subsequent passengers after that Ebola patient rode in his car need to be notified that they rode in a car in which previously, luckily the answer to that question was no. But the reason I use this example is we connected with all the right people there. We decided to put out the statement saying that we were working in lockstep with the city and with the public health department. And there were a lot of press inquiries, as you can imagine, because around Uber, there always are. And we addressed all of those. We put out a proactive communication to our riders and drivers. And then we started to get a ton of inbound from riders asking, hey, did I ride in that car? I want to know if I rode in that car. Did I have that driver? And it was a really hard moment because the instinct of our local team who runs the business in New York was, well, this person didn't ride in the car. We can answer them and say, no, you didn't. But if we had answered that question and said, no, you didn't ride in that car, it implies that if they had, there would be a problem. And even though it was really hard to stay disciplined and not provide any more detail than we had already provided to that point, and that was just in a direct, email channel, customer inquiries, not in the public domain. We just held firm and those questions abated. So that was an example where the course we had chosen worked well. It could be the case that a course chosen doesn't work well, and you'll know because the volume will continue to increase and you'll start to see more shoes dropping and you'll get all those inquiries, and then you haven't gone far enough. So anyway, that's one example I wanted to share that shows that it really is important to pick a strategy, execute, and wait before changing. Work with lawyers, but not for lawyers. There are 3 legs of a crisis stool. 1 is the business, 2 is legal, and 3 is communications. Each leg has to give a little, each leg has to get a little. But the worst communications plan you can ever execute, and this is true for internal, it's true for external, is one where your lawyer is writing your comms. And lawyers are the first to admit this. It's their job is to mitigate risk. But as some of you may know from your professional experience, you can put out comms that mitigate risk on one side, that create much greater brand risk on another side, that turns into legal risk. And so if you put out a tone-deaf message about something so that your lawyers are satisfied, and often these are out-of-house lawyers, there are creative ones. I shouldn't bash all lawyers, and I've had great partnerships with attorneys, and you just have to make sure that you have those 3 kind of stools represented, because absent one of them, the formula doesn't work. But if you just go with that very legalistic risk mitigation strategy, you can end up having many more legal issues on a different side. So work with them, but not for them. They would never ask you, a comms person, let's say you're a comms person or you have a comms person. The comms person would never be volunteering to write a legal brief. So don't let a lawyer volunteer to write any sort of communication statement. Internal is external. You have to think about your internal audiences. I think COVID is such a good example of that. Whether your company is undergoing a RIF or just this like transformative work from home environment, you have to be thinking about your people first as a key audience. And you have to also assume, and we'll get into a little bit more detail on this a bit later, that anything internal is also external. Get your message out in proportion to the crisis. If you do that well, the strategy that you execute on should cover it. But it's hard to always know in advance, also because you just kind of don't always know what's out there. But the goal is to be proportional. You know, for something, we can use Zoom as an example, right? They were in a load of hot water last week. And, you know, some might argue still are. But, you know, Eric Juan really stepped up and owned it, and they were working on making some changes. If they had, like, you know, removed him as CEO, that would be a way, way overcorrection. If they had been much milder about it and just said, yeah, it's not really an issue, no big deal, that would be an under response. And so you really do have to like find that line and make sure you kind of gut check your response with a couple of impartial folks, so that, and this is not just on the comms, but actually like, what are we doing? Make sure you gut check it, because it's helpful to get that outside point of view. And finally, don't defend by being defensive. I don't know how, you know, I don't know what proportion of people who ended up joining this call are founders, but, or CEOs, but it's just hard. I mean, your company is like your baby. It's like a piece of you. And so I really understand that. I understand how hard it is not to get defensive, especially when you feel like some external perception or internal perception isn't quite right. But trust me, it only gets worse if you defend yourself by being defensive. So just bear that in mind. Next, okay, adapt. Course correct when you absolutely need to. You may need to go bigger. You'll know after a couple days. I'll use another Uber example. I don't know if folks remember, but several years ago, sorry, I might have a toddler interrupting, but several years ago, there was a mass shooting in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And the shooter had been an Uber driver and had driven around and shot people all night, like in parking lots. And he was not attacking his passengers, but he did kill people. And so that was a rough, really, really difficult situation for our whole country and for that community in Kalamazoo. And it was definitely a gnarly one for us too at Uber. It was really tragic. We, really were, I think, nailed a good response from a messaging standpoint and a communication standpoint. It was empathetic. I'm sorry, I'm looking around. There's a toddler. It's going to probably pop up on the screen in a minute. We're empathetic and focused and, talked about the response and the partnership with local law enforcement. But the volume of interest in our point of view and what we were doing was just simply too high to be quelled by, putting that messaging out over the channels that we had decided at that point. So about 24 hours into it, we said we need to do something more. And so what we did is we got our chief security officer and global head of communications and public policy at the time on a conference call with 100 reporters, everyone from the auto reporters to the law enforcement reporters, national, people who'd covered Uber before, people who'd never covered Uber before, and that helped, and it was an important step. The other piece of navigating through a crisis is that you have to keep quiet for a while. So once you decide on your strategy and you put it out there, just kind of see how it plays, keep a little bit quiet for a bit. And then you'll have to figure this out on your own, but you'll have to figure out when it's time to turn the page. Too soon, we'll feel tone deaf, depending on the crisis you're coming out of. And then too late, you're leaving money on the table. So you should, bear that in mind as well. Okay, don't forget, this is super important. If you're in a crisis scenario, you have to turn off most, if not all, of your growth and brand marketing. I'm going to go into a COVID-specific slide in the next one. So I'll pause a second thought there, but it really is super important because think about it, your growth and brand marketing content and copy was written at a time where the environment for you and your company and organization were totally different. People cannot receive that message in the same way if they're only thinking about you with this patina of the crisis on it. We talked about this a little bit, but in order to help navigate best the internal and dynamics in crisis, there are three things that I like to bear in mind. One, it's a really important time to showcase your leadership. And for a lot of companies, that means, sweetie, I can't talk right now. Okay, can you go upstairs? Good to see you. Yeah, almost done. Okay, go upstairs. For a lot of companies that are really small, that it may be, not right now, but in general, it may be about getting like 3 or 4 employees in a room. And it doesn't make the leadership component any less important. For some, it's convening, thousands of employees across time zones. But really, putting your leadership out there is really, really important to employees, to customers, to venture capitalists, to whoever your key constituencies are. You can't just hide behind corporate speak at that point. It's important to put a face on it. Put your employees first. Make sure that they are not an afterthought. It's so easy to think with the pressure of your external audiences who are coming at you asking for information and forget, and then you're just like, oh, we decided what we're doing, here's the plan, here's the comms, I'll just send an FYI to the team. Treat your employees like a key constituency. They are a key constituency, and put them first. And part of that means ensuring that in a crisis, there's an opportunity for two-way communication, not just unidirectional top-down. And finally, bring core partners into the tent. Again, for who, each of you have different key constituencies, but bring them on the inside, provide some visibility and transparency. It's really important. And we'll talk a little bit about sort of what I think the key elements of successful leadership are, and transparency is one of them. And then I don't know where my COVID slide went, but I'm going to talk about it. Maybe it may have disappeared in a version control. Oh, here it is. I glossed over it. Okay, let's do this quickly. I'm going to pull up a different doc while I chat. So we put out a memo to our portfolio companies a little while back during the beginning of this crisis. And because one of the first things companies had to think about was, how are we marketing and what are we marketing? And so, can you still see my slide, Steffi?
Yes.
Okay, great. So there are three categories of companies in the current environment. And even though we've achieved some sort of new normal where there's a little bit more mind share available to think about non-COVID stuff, I would still argue that this rubric applies. So you have to think through where you fall in the category. So category one, must do internal marketing. So the companies that fit into this category are, sorry, let me back up. There are three categories of marketing considerations. One is must do internal marketing, two is discretionary, and three is tone and timing. Those are the three main buckets. The must do things are for anyone who has a team, you're communicating with your people. That's internal marketing, right? You're setting priorities, you're understanding that your roadmap is suddenly different, and you're ensuring that you're hitting the right cadence. That's one example. The key things here are transparency, frequency, and leadership. And that's true for your customers, right? Customers want to know if you're in business. Consumers want to know if they can order your product. Your partners want to understand, what's the latest, what's going on. So you have to be able to communicate with those audiences. It's not optional. That's a little bit more like of an internal feel. Then on discretionary marketing, which is sort of the optional, there are also three categories: relevant, tangential, and unrelated. So highly relevant companies: Instacart, One Medical, Zoom. Any company that's been deeply, deeply impacted by the current crisis, has to communicate to its audience. But then there's this middle bucket where I call it tangential. Examples.
Hey, Nairi,
Row
sorry to
Health.
interrupt. Do you mind pressing present so it's full screen?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm just reading through notes in this memo and it won't let me do that and be full screen.
Oh, no worries.
So I'll go back to it in a minute.
Cool.
If that's okay.
Of course.
So the tangential bucket, it's some company like Row Health. Row Health is a company in the Canaan portfolio that adapted in the moment and launched a sort of like triage telehealth offering, and I think is available now in all 50 states, where people could come to them as like one of the leading telehealth platforms and understand if they have any of the signs of COVID. It was a totally new product offering for them, but it was related, not directly initially impacted as a business, but highly related. And so of course they did marketing around that. That's one example. The unrelated category, I can go back to my full screen now. The unrelated category is, let's see, here we go. Sorry, trying.
It's upper right corner.
Yeah. So is that better?
Yep.
Is that working?
Yeah, that's great.
Great. So the unrelated category is when it gets harder. So you obviously have product you're ready to ship. You have a round you were ready to announce. You have a big CFO hire you wanted to put out there, and you were planning for all of this. And then now we're in this new environment. Do you announce it? Do you not? If there's any way to wait, not because it's going to have terrible blowback for you to put it out in the current environment, and there are ways, by the way, to make it work, but because it's just not going to get the attention that it may warrant. That doesn't mean you can't go out with your piece of news or your it may not even be press-worthy news, but your announcement, it could be internal or your content. But, you know, it's really important that if you do, you have to acknowledge the elephant in the room, because otherwise you just seem like super, super tone deaf. And that's the last key point, I think, on COVID marketing and comms. And I'm glossing over this very quickly. We can go deeper on any key thing here, but the keys are tone and timing across all categories, whether you're doing it as a relevant company, a tangential company, or an unrelated company, doing it for the sort of must-do communications that you're already executing on. It's the most important thing, and I know something you probably all take super seriously. And then lastly, before we go look at the questions, these are sort of the key categories of questions that you all sent in advance. How do you engage with customers and clients? How do you have the confidence to sell right now if your pipeline is looking so paltry? How do you engage with them when they're struggling? How do you reach out to a customer and say, hey, buy my product, when they've just laid off a bunch of their people? And so I would just say I'm just going to do high level on these. Again, it's navigable. You have to be very sensitive, acknowledge the reality that they're facing. If you are a product or service reaching out to a customer, and that customer, and it's sort of like a non-essential product for them, I would wait. Again, it's all about timing and tone. But if it's something where, you know, they still need you, you want them to know you're open for business, you're there to support them, you know, you want them to make sure, you want to make sure they know your customer success team is ready for them, that your customer service is on point, ready to go, do it. I don't think it's impossible. In terms of the confidence, go back to first principles. Why did you start this company? Why are you running sales for this company? You believe it has a real market opportunity, that it's better than everything else that was out there. And so go back to that. Don't look at your current sales pipeline. I mean, there are companies that have gone from revenue, like very solid, like we all wish we had that kind of revenue in our organizations, to almost nothing, gone off a cliff overnight. Don't look at that. Think about the promise of your product, why you started the company in the first place. Go back and read, if you're a founder or CEO, your fundraising decks, your last fundraising decks, to get that re-inspiration, and focus on that. But there's no question that it's hard to sell in this environment. How do you show your team that, you know, you are their leader, you are doing what's in their best interest, and yet you don't have all the answers? Also not easy. It's okay to show vulnerability. In fact, I would argue anyone who pretends they have all the answers and doesn't show vulnerability actually feels like less of a leader. That's my personal opinion. But I think in general, we agree that vulnerability is an attribute of strong leadership. And you have to showcase that to the team. It is hard to be in the current environment we're in and maintain the velocity of productivity. I know, because we have a lot of women on this call, in particular for any of us who are juggling kids and family. So, you know, make sure you're communicating early and often. Recreate the water cooler moments virtually. The sort of culture building and solidifying moments that you had, try to find a way to do it virtually. And make sure that you're doing the one responsibility that leaders certainly have in this environment. We're toggling a little bit between team and executive leadership, is helping your teams prioritize. They need to know what's most important in the current environment. Can you launch a product? You absolutely can launch a product if you have to. There may be products that have nothing to do with COVID that actually have never been more important. I ordered my first set of like stick-on nail things today through a portfolio company ours called Manny, because it's time. You know, I'm being a little facetious, but it's true. There may be products that you can launch, or new product features that are actually super well received by your customer base because of what's going on, even though they have nothing to do with the actual crisis itself. Again, it all comes back to tone, timing, and making sure that you're acknowledging the elephant in the room. And then from an executive leadership perspective, look, any of the internal comms work that you do, communicating with confidence to your customers. Maybe you're doing a really important call with with your board chair, with that key customer, with a reporter. It's one of the key ways to exude confidence is to actually prepare and be ready. That's no different if you're just sitting up there and addressing your team, whether you're doing, you're executing on a riff. Write it down, practice your messages, practice in the mirror, make sure people know that you're taking this seriously. And preparation is one of the best ways to generate that confidence. Not to say that's easy, definitely not easy. It's okay to show that vulnerability. I would over-index on transparency at a time like this. Say when you don't answer, that's okay. But making sure that you're putting yourself out there and making yourself available to the team is super important. So I'll stop there so that we can go into any additional questions. And I'm gonna click this.
There was a question submitted that I thought was pretty great and specific. Is there anyone you would suggest people follow who's consistently struck a good tone in communications lately, companies or people?
I loved the Marriott CEO's video. For those of you who haven't watched it, he was awesome. He did this video for his entire employee base. Thousands of people, they call them, I think, Marriott associates, that basically was communicating the reduction in force. I can't remember if it was furlough or RIF at this point, but he was very human. He was very realistic that this was the hardest thing he had ever dealt with in his professional career. And he also got a little bit emotional, but he was clear. He had very clearly was like, I've never been more committed. We've got this. So I highly recommend watching that Marriott video. It's a real profile in courage and leadership.
If people have questions, feel free to drop them in Q&A or the chat. Otherwise, we'll move on to some of the questions you submitted. I think there was another one that asked about comm strategy that avoids jumping on a bandwagon or being cliche and insensitive. You mentioned tone a couple times earlier. Do you have some specifics that people should keep in mind to avoid being insensitive right now?
Yeah, I think it's hard to make generalizations just because everybody on this call is coming from such a different sector and stage and audience perspective. But, I think the most important thing is to let your audience know that right? Like, we know this is a crazy time. This is a hard time. But we've never been more committed than ever to build a product that X, Y, and Z to, make life easier for this or that through our service, to spark joy in people's lives. It's never been more important to have a little bit of joy and inspiration in your home. I'm a devoted consumer of farm girl flowers. They're not in the portfolio. I just don't want them to go out of business, right? And I really appreciate that they have been proactive in communicating, and it kind of engenders loyalty in a slightly different way, but it's flowers. Like, what could be more trivial in the current environment? But the way they've done it, I think, and maybe about the people impacted, the employees, has been smart. But it's all, I don't understand the bandwagon bit of that question exactly. But I would say, just in terms of not seeming like tone deaf, it's just super important to make clear that you're communicating within the environment.
That makes a lot of sense. There was another question about any recommendations to create rapport online. Now, clearly, like a lot of this stuff is done over Zoom like this. Any best practices you've picked up on since we've all gone digital?
Yeah. I do think that it's even more important to institutionalize that personal sharing and vulnerability that's important for any team building. making sure that you as a leader are setting the tone for that by being open and transparent, by saying, you know what, I'm having a shitty day today because we just lost this amount in revenue and I'm bummed about it, but I'm going to be bummed about it for the next 2 hours and then I'm going to move on. And the way I'm going to move on is I'm going to go for a run or whatever, whatever that personal sharing is that's right for you. Making sure to model that so that your employees feel like they have a safe place as well. Ensuring that, you take that time for the little water cooler moments. I heard there's a great new product out there that someone on my team was telling me called Icebreaker. I haven't used it yet, but supposedly it's good at doing exactly this. You could just do the standard red, yellow, green exercise at the top of your stand-ups or your weekly meeting and just say, hey, what's everybody today, red, yellow, or green, and why? It can be an amazing connector. Forcing people to be on video. Make sure people are on video. This is not a time to be on the phone, especially for those important face-to-face meetings, face-to-face. So, mandate it as a leader of your organization.
Anyone have questions they want to drop in the chat? I think, oh, I see some popped up. Okay, we've got one question. This one might be a little bit outside comms, but I'll just throw it out there. Advice on hiring given the tough times. That one's probably hard to answer, but.
Well, I mean, I would say, depending on your specifics, you may need to keep hiring, right? I think that the key things about hiring, and I don't know if the question is more about worrying about making the process work well, I'm guessing that may be it, is that getting that internal alignment on what you're looking for in the hire, making sure the panel of interviewees is well briefed, things are documented, it's actually a good forcing function not to be able to have just water cooler conversation of like, oh, hey, did you like that interviewee? I mean, I know I'm sure most people on this call don't do that kind of recruiting anymore, but it's tempting, right? You're moving a mile a minute to organize your thoughts into an email and talk about that candidate that you just saw. It takes extra time. So I think it can be a good forcing function and actually can be positive for D&I because it forces you to put your needs on paper, really look at the language and then get aligned. But I would say, look, people are still going to look for jobs. There's more talent out there than has ever been out there, at least in the startup ecosystem because of all of the layoffs that have happened, and high quality talent because these are not performance-based eliminations by and large. So I would aim to do it.
Another question, what's the best approach to launching a pilot program to our customers right now? Video, Medium articles, introducing the founder and product? Just thinking of marketing ways that don't cost a lot of money.
Yeah, owned channels can be super powerful. I totally agree that not spending money is a great idea. And then I would say you could do any of those channels, any of those options. I would say video is hard if you don't already have rapport as a brand with your audience, because it takes an extra level of interest to click play on a video that you have to sit through versus scrolling through the written word content. But I would say yes to all of the above. And you could host Zoom sessions to educate your customers on the product and go through product demos. I would make a cool animation of your pilot program that is really easy to understand, and if you have any design resources in-house, and if you don't, that's okay too, but I assume you have a way to visualize the product flow and therefore probably can do that. So I think you're on the right track. And then I see another question from that person asking if investors post-COVID are more hesitant to invest in pre-product, pre-revenue startups. I don't think so. I think that the investor challenge, as you've seen a lot of people say out there, is bandwidth, but not necessarily like that stage concern, because early stage investors are always investing pre-product, pre-revenue. It's sort of like what they do, and a revenue like revenue today is such a false indicator because of the current environment that I actually don't think the pre-product, pre-revenue status of a company is a negative.
All right, so there's a follow-up question to the cliche bandwagon theme, but how can you lift up organizations that are doing critical service work like feeding the unhoused, working with seniors, in a way that directs people and resources to them, but also doesn't look like you're trying to bite off of their efforts?
Trying to like share in their halo around it. Is there a way to put dollars around it? Could you allocate a small dollar amount to each of your employees and ask and offer them the opportunity to choose an organization that they want to have dollars go to, and then, you know, highlight sort of like, these are the organizations that our team is passionate about in the current environment and we're grateful to them, etc. Is there, if you make it all about the ocean, and make it authentic and keep it pretty light touch. I wouldn't do too much comms around whatever support you feel for these other organizations, but, you know, making sure that if you're doing real team-based support for them, that you can communicate that. That's fine. I would just ask in that scenario, what are your goals? If you go back to your goals, is it because you want your key constituencies to know that those are your values? That's a fair reason. Is it because you want your, you just feel like you need to communicate something in the current environment? That makes it a little trickier. So just making sure you're super clear about what your goals would be.
This next question comes from a founder, I'm assuming. How would you suggest founders reach out to potential employees when they haven't been funded yet? And also, how are you empathetic to employees who were laid off? I think those are two separate questions, I guess.
Maybe I can ask a follow-up, and then we can wait for that while I take the next one, which would be, do you mean, how are you empathetic to potential recruits, or empathetic to your own employees who have been laid off? And then is the potential employees meaning like potential recruits for you? I just want to make sure I understand the question. And then in the meantime, I can take the next one. Best way to communicate a pivot in business plans in response to the crisis, particularly to potential investors and partners. Well, I think the first thing is to really codify whether it's a long-term pivot or a short-term pivot. And, you know, again, be upfront about it. This is the way we survive. This is the way we survive COVID and this pandemic. We actually think it can give us leverage because X and Y and Z, although it's still not our long-term mission. We think it, you know, if we get through this environment by making this pivot, we think it gives us a tailwind to achieving our bigger mission. I mean, that would be ideal. I don't know if that's factual, but that would be an ideal way to do it. But I would just be proactive and upfront, especially if you're going to need to fundraise at any point. You know, I think there's never been a better time to showcase to investors your leadership chops, because this is really a time when people who thrive in these uncertain environments, which a startup is an uncertain environment anyway, you really can see those who are naturally gifted at it, and being upfront, being proactive, being realistic, and also being super creative about how to navigate really does stand out to investors. Okay, so the other question, potential recruits, yes. So I'm gonna go back to the, so let's see, yeah, so reaching out to potential recruits, yeah, I don't think you need to worry too much about what their, if they were laid off from their employer. I would just say, if you feel like your funding is, you can always be building, you should always be building relationships, period. That's true with investors, that's true with potential partners, with potential customers, with potential employees. This is a great time to do some relationship building because so many other work streams have to get put on pause. So doing some of that foundation building is super important. But yes, I think reaching out to those recruits, you know, if you can't hire them until you're funded, be upfront with them about that. You know, acknowledge that this is a time where some people feel less of an appetite to take risk if there's a potential recruit who's otherwise gainfully employed. But making sure that you're just being honest and upfront about your timing, I think, is the most important thing if you want that person to convert over time.
All right, next one from Juliet. We are considering using our technology to release a COVID-relevant product. How do we do that without making our current users feel ignored? We are a digital health startup and focus on autoimmune patients as users.
I would just say that I guess it sounds like the COVID relevant product would be more for mass audience than just for autoimmune patients who are obviously a high risk category within the COVID. So it sounds like if you're thinking about concentric circles, your autoimmune cohort would still be able to benefit from this product, but it would be a totally different message. And suddenly you're not talking to this smaller community, you're talking to a much bigger one, and that warrants a different message. You know, I think going to them first, go to your loyal user base first. They're where you started. Talk about how you're so proud to have their support and that you've been able to support them through this difficult time for that community, which it is. And let them know first that you're going to be building a new product. And by first, it can be like, you know, an email that goes out 5 minutes before, depending on what stage you're at, right? It doesn't need to be a long time before. You don't need to do it days in advance. But making sure you're giving them that respect early on, and, you know, figuring out if there's a value of the new product to that existing cohort. Sorry, I don't know if I can speak more specifically than that, but I would say if you have an opportunity to launch a product that's highly relevant in the current environment, do it, and just figure out how to navigate the comms separately.
This one's on the flip side of that, which is recommendations on rebuilding trust with your customers post-COVID if you had to disappoint them by scaling back on services during the crisis. Nairi, I think that you are frozen on the screen right now. Maybe you'll come back in a moment.
Yeah.
Are you there, Nairi? Sorry, I can't hear you.
You cannot?
Oh, we can hear you now.
Okay, yeah, sorry, it's my home Wi-Fi. Craps out from time to time. I'm sure you all get it. Anyway, so what I was gonna say is understanding, first of all, acknowledging that you disappointed them, right? Like acknowledge the facts, but maybe you use that time to add a feature set that they had been asking for, or to address any other feedback that you knew that they had, or maybe that you launched a new feature just from your own creativity. So I would say it's important to acknowledge that they will be feeling that way, but also come to the table with something of substance that shows you've been working for them in the meantime in the way that you were able to. And then in terms of, oh, I see leadership strength to potential investors, how do you show it? Some examples of channels and messages. I think for existing investors, you know, it's all of the same attributes we talked about. Being willing to, you know, say that you don't have all the answers, being willing to be vulnerable at times, but at the same time, being creative and clear-eyed and focused about what you need to do. I think one of the other attributes for that really stands out is the way that leaders in the current environment are kind of cultivating their team and morale, because that is the secret sauce of any organization. You can't get anything done if your people aren't mission aligned. And so, making, sharing some of those internal wins, internal moments with your board, with your investors. And then for prospective investors, it's a little bit harder. They don't have day-to-day touch points with your company and your organization. But, choosing the handful that you want to keep brief because they're on your, top list for your next fundraise, which hopefully is not right now. Sending them periodic updates, just the way you would in a normal environment, but really showcasing sort of like what's gone well, what's been hard, and then like maybe like a silver lining, being as, balancing optimism with realism, I think is the best way, and then just putting pedal to the metal.
All right. Well, I don't see any other open questions. So wanted to let everyone know that we did record this session and we will be posting a blog post with the key takeaways. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Nairi, for sharing your insights. This is really, really amazing and applicable to so many people, founders, VCs, operators alike.
Thank you all. Great to be with you. Thank you for taking your time to be with AllRaise today. It's totally my pleasure.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.